Welcome to the Proud to Be Profane podcast, where we're not afraid to drop a few F-bombs, make some dirty jokes, or pee on the all-seeing pyramid of Illuminati enlightenment. And now, here's your host, Mr. Michael Joseph. Welcome to the Proud to Be Profane podcast. All right, welcome to episode number 2 of the Proud to Be Profane podcast. Last time we had Mr. Isaac Weishaupt on to discuss all of the strangeness in the entertainment industry, and we will be continuing that today with Mr. Mark Devlin. But we will be focusing on the hip-hop aspects of the entertainment industry, and we will also be focusing on the idea of the 5% nation and the Islamic influence that has its roots with people like Africa Bambaataa, who has recently had some strange allegations placed upon him in relation to childhood pedophilia. Not exactly the most uplifting topic, but for the most part, we talk about the strange influence of this 5% nation in a lot of what is deemed to be more enlightened hip-hop, and how that kind of blurs into the whole bitches and hoes type of hip-hop. That's my shit, dog. Word. I don't know how gangsta that sounded from a white boy from Vermont, but that's just how we roll today. Talking all about the hip-hop scene, and there's a lot of strange stuff. So we're going to break this one up into 2 parts, at least. And today we'll lay down the foundation for some of the key figures and some of the general principles of this 5% ideology. And we will go into some of the strange deaths surrounding hip-hop, such as Tupac, Biggie, Prodigy from Mobb Deep, Guru from Gangstar, and see where it goes from there. And I guess maybe something to keep in mind is the story of the Pharisees in the New Testament, where Christ says that, "Listen to all that they say, for they say righteous things, but they don't actually do those righteous things themselves." And whatever way you want to take that, whether it be literally, metaphorically, just a piece of literature that gives a moral teaching, I don't really care, but I think the message is pretty relevant in this entire discussion with all of these ideas of so-called enlightened hip-hop. So, without further ado, welcome to episode number 2 with Mr. Mark Devlin. All right, well, Mark, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for coming on. I've been a big fan of your work for a while. The first time I ever listened to you was way back when you were on the John Wells show, Caravan to Midnight, and ever since then, I've always kept up with what you've had to say, and you cover quite a lot in the realm of mainly hip-hop, but a lot of entertainment industry, and I really appreciate your work, so thank you for being on the podcast.
No worries, man. Good to be on. Looking forward to getting into this conversation today, and it's going to be hip-hop based, which is, if anything, a novelty for me these days because I've taken on so many different areas of research, and I'm going into rock music and all kinds of different genres that I never listened to growing up. So I'm getting so much knowledge on all these different areas of music, but it's great for me to be able to return to the one that has meant the most to me over the years today. We're probably going to be going to some unwelcome corners of it, but, you know, it's good to do that. We need to get this stuff discussed and out there.
Yeah, and there's just so much information and so many strange little esoteric underpinnings to all of this. But before we get into that, I don't know if you want to give just a little bit of a background into you. I'm sure a lot of my subscribers already know who you are, so you can keep it as long or as brief as you'd like. But I'd also like to know maybe 1 or 2 key moments in your life where everything kind of changed and you looked at the world in a completely different way, and what were some of those time markers and how did it affect you?
All right. Well, I've been a club and radio DJ out of the UK for the past 28 years now. And all the way up to 2010, from 1990 when I got started, it was just a case of me doing gigs, doing radio shows, interviewing artists. I was a writer as well. I wrote for Blues and Soul magazine here in the UK and a few other magazines as well. And really, I just went through the motions of what is expected of you as a DJ and a writer, played the industry game very much, never really gave any kind of thought as to the way the industry was structured or whether there was more to know about it beneath what lies on the surface. And things got to a point in around about 2007, 2008, where I was starting to read the books of David Icke, which were very influential on me in those early years. It was my dad that got me into reading them because he's always been a deep thinking guy and quite a prodigious reader. And he sort of put me onto the books of Icke and other authors as well. But it was the books of David Icke that really woke me up to the fact that this world is actually nothing like we've spent our entire lives being conditioned to think it is. And it got to 2010, and something happened in that year where it felt like all the pieces of the puzzle came together and everything made sense in a way that it hadn't up to that point. So I guess it's what people refer to as a conscious awakening. There wasn't a single kind of catalytic event or a eureka moment or anything like that. It was just a coming together of all this knowledge that I'd picked up. But my mind goes back to the very early days when I first got started in the music business in 1990, because something was happening to me then in the early part of 1990. And it's very interesting when you hear researchers like David Icke and many others actually talking about that time when the 80s gave way to the 1990s. It was a time of great change in the world. So at the end of 1989, you had the breakup of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism in so many Eastern Bloc countries. And all that was happening. And it really felt like the world was changing. And I tapped into that. It felt like it was something spiritual at the time. I felt very differently about the world and my place in it, but I had absolutely no clue what was going on. We didn't have the internet back then, and I didn't have anyone to talk to about it other than an aunt of mine who was a Christian. And I spoke to her about the fact that I was starting to feel different about things and I felt like I was tapping into some kind of changes. And she interpreted that as a calling from God for me to join the church, you know, as she would. So she kind of inducted me into this Christian evangelical church, which I attended for the next 4 years. And I came out of that process even more puzzled and disillusioned than I was when I went into it, because I hadn't found the answers that I was seeking. All I'd seen within that church was what I considered to be hypocrisy from many of the members and, families kind of patting each other on the back and looking after each other a bit like the Freemasons do. And so I was even more confused after all that. And it actually turned me into an atheist for many, many years. I was just of the view that there is no God, there's no spirituality, there's nothing. Very nihilistic viewpoint. It wasn't until that period, around about 2007, where I reassessed my viewpoint on that. And now, of course, I absolutely understand that there is a divine creative force and that we're aspects of it. But it's very interesting for me to look back at those times, 1990, because something was happening. And I think there were some consciousness shifts happening, which other people were tapping into. And I was on the cusp of it, but of course, I didn't know what to do with it. And sometimes when I think back, I'm full of regret that I didn't wake up, so to speak, round about those times. But then I think, well, if I had, I probably would not have pursued this career as a DJ for the next 20 odd years, which means I wouldn't have got all this knowledge and all this experience, which I'm now bringing to bear in my research. And so the two books that I've just written would not have been written in the way that they were. So I think everything happens for a reason. It happens when it's meant to happen and not a minute before. I'm sorry that's such a long-winded response, but that's where it is.
Oh, no worries. I have sort of a similar background to some extent where I was pursuing music and putting many, many hours into learning guitar. And in retrospect, if I had known the things that I know now, that would have really put a huge damper on my motivations. But at the same time, going through that process of learning the instrument really helped me, I don't know, work my brain in different ways, left side and right side. And I think ultimately it made me a more intelligent person just by working different aspects of your mind that you don't usually do. So, the whole regret thing, I know it's easy to have that pop up, but at the same time, things kind of happen the way they need to based on where you're at. So I wouldn't worry too much about that.
Well, I think we have life plans, whether it's a higher aspect of ourselves in a different state of consciousness that draw up these plans before we incarnate here, or whether we're kind of under instruction in terms of some of the stuff that we go through. But I do believe our lives are the basic framework for the lives that we live are mapped out for us, I believe. Obviously, there's free will. There's always free will and consent present. So your life can go off in many different directions. But the basic framework, I think, of where in the world you're going to be, the people you're going to be around, what you're going to do with your life, I think is all part of a life plan that's drawn up beforehand. That's my viewpoint on it now.
Yeah, I view it similarly, where it's a blend of both. There's certain things that I think you're quote unquote fated to, you can't really avoid, your parents, things like that, and maybe certain people in your life. But then within that context, you have your own choices you can make where you're in control and whatnot. But kind of touching upon what you were saying before, where you kind of see these things, and then now you look back on them, and it's a different perspective. That kind of gets us into the territory that we're going to discuss today with hip hop. And for me, I was into a lot of this type of music that we'll be talking about when I was in my late teens, and seeing things there, it kind of I had these like little red flag moments or these weird things about some of that. I was kind of like, I don't know about this, but I was also very into a lot of like I don't know, the beats and the music, and it just a certain amount of the lyrics identify with me, and I could definitely tell a lot of this hip hop was more than just the whole quote unquote bitches and hoes stuff with like Snoop Dogg and Dre. So this is kind of around the idea of the 5% nation, and we might not get into this completely today. It might be a discussion for another time, but we'll basically lay the groundwork. And I just wanted to talk about some of the key figures in hip hop, and in particular, this idea of the 5%ers. So can you describe what a 5%er is and the ideology a bit, and then the role that it's played in hip-hop as far as you understand it?
Okay, well, the role that it's played in hip-hop, I've come to realize quite recently, is absolutely massive. And it's starting to look as if for any hip-hop MC to have achieved any great degree of success and become a household name, it's almost a requirement that they adhere to the doctrines of the 5% nation, also known as the nation of gods and earths. So when you look at some of the names that crop up in its ranks, or in terms of those that have espoused its teachings, you get the likes of Rakim, Big Daddy Kane, LL Cool J, Brand Nubian, Guru Gangstar, Poor Righteous Teachers, Busta Rhymes, A Tribe Called Quest, Lakim Shabazz, Wu-Tang Clan, Jay-Z, Nas, Erykah Badu, Jay Electronica, Immortal Technique, also Kool Herc and Afrika Bambaataa, considered to be the founders of hip-hop and hip-hop culture and turntablism, have also studied 5% teachings as well and spoken about it, as has Fab Five Freddy. So I've interviewed a lot of these dudes, actually. I interviewed Big Daddy Kane, Fab Five Freddy, Guru, Busta Rhymes, and quite a few others in that list. It's very interesting when you consider that Jay-Z is arguably the biggest hip-hop name of the past 20-odd years. He's held that crown for a long time. And a lot of hip-hop heads would say that the number two for most of those years has belonged to Nas. So both of those are stated 5%ers. Then if you take it back to the 80s and you consider who the most prominent MCs were in the 1980s, then Rakim and Big Daddy Kane's names will crop up. And they, again, are members of these ranks. So that's why I say it seems to be like a de facto requirement. So the Nation of Gods and Earths, which is known as the 5%ers, is linked to the Nation of Islam, which is this organization founded in Detroit in 1930 by Wallace D. Fard Muhammad. And the leadership of that organization went to Elijah Muhammad from 1934, who was its leader for pretty much 40 years. And then Louis Farrakhan, Minister Farrakhan, who is still the leader of that organization today, at the age of 80-something, took over in the mid-1970s from Wallace D. Fard's son. So it's a very far-reaching organization, and the Nation of Islam was portrayed in Spike Lee's 1992 movie featuring Denzel Washington, Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, of course, was a very high-profile member of this organization before he broke away from it shortly before his assassination in February 1965. So you've got, and also Muhammad Ali, previously known as Cassius Clay, was another high-profile member of the Nation of Islam, incidentally. And I think Cat Stevens went over to that. I think he certainly changed his name to Yusuf Islam, and I think he started espousing their teachings as well. So the Nation of Gods and Earths, which is also known as the Five Percenters, as I say, evolved out of Harlem in 1964 under the mentorship of Clarence Smith, who was known as Allah the Father. That's the name that he gave himself, so no egotism going on there. It was pretty much a splinter group from the Nation of Islam. So this guy, Clarence Smith, drew up his own teachings, his own kind of dogma. And there was a lot of talk of supreme mathematics, the supreme alphabet, and the 120 lessons, which was remodeled from the Nation of Islam's supreme teachings. So it's all about spirituality and metaphysics and the meaning of the universe and adherence to this Godhead that they revere, So it's pretty much a religion in its own right. There's also some teachings which exalt the black man as a god on earth and asserting that the black race are the forebears of all humanity. So, you're starting to get into some murky territory there for some. The name Allah, which this Clarence Smith guy adopted for himself, also seems to have been adopted by certain rappers. So Rakim was also known as Rakim Allah. And RZA, who was the founder and the frontman and the producer of the Wu-Tang Clan, his name, RZA, comes from Rakim Zigazag Allah. I asked him what the origin of RZA was when I interviewed him, and he said, well, that's what the name means. Then we also have the Wu-Tang Clan member Mathematics, who would seem to have been named after that Gods and Earths doctrine. So the Poor Righteous Teachers, who were a group in the early 90s, put out a track called Gods, Earths and 85ers, which was all about this sort of faction that had influenced them. You also had a track from Brand Nubian, which came out in 1992, called The Meaning of the 5%. And that basically explained these fractions, these figures which crop up in the teachings of the Nations of Gods and Earths. It explains what the 85% are, what the 5% are, and what the remaining 10% are. And that track consists of a sermon from Louis Farrakhan over a looped sample lick from a Marvin Gaye record. So in that record, you hear that the 5% are the so-called poor righteous teachers, and they're supposed to be the awakened, illuminated, educated ones represented by the Gods and Earths who understand the secrets of the universe and what humanity is all about, what the mission is. Then you've got the 10%, which they state are what we would think of, I guess, as the Illuminati or the elites, the controllers, the wicked ones that are presiding over humanity with this satanic control system that they've got. And the remaining 85% are the masses, the sleeping masses, everybody else, the great unwashed, who are totally ignorant to spiritual truths. So that's what their teachings are all about. And I've got a variation on that in my upcoming book, actually. In the final chapter, I give my own take on these divisions that we have. And let me just call up the reference to that. Yeah, my take on it, which I've detailed in the final chapter of my book, is the way I see it, you've got three divisions of humanity. And this was pretty much inspired for me by listening to Brand Nubian, Meaning of the 5%, that Farrakhan sermon. So you've got the first division, which is attackers. And I've said these are those who like to think of themselves as the elite class. They're the smallest of the three groupings by number. They're individuals with an advanced understanding of the occult, knowledge of the human psyche and how it operates, and how it in turn interacts with the rest of creation. These people have studied the nature of reality and understand how consciousness and the applied will of the individual can help shape the reality that's experienced on both an individual and a collective basis if properly applied. Unfortunately for everyone else, this group is not out for the upliftment and advancement of all humanity. They do not serve creation and the force that most would refer to as God. Second division, I've said, are defenders, and this is a group that's increasing in number by the day. They're the real enemies of the first group, and these are individuals who are coming to the same understandings about the nature of self and reality and our true power when our will is engaged. And then the third division I've called wanderers, and this is the largest group of all, and it's in the crosshairs of each of the other two. So again, this is the sleeping masses. It comprises the vast majority of humanity. It's the masses who are still deeply entrenched in the ignorance of base consciousness, and both the elites and the awakened ones are trying to win over the hearts and souls of this grouping. So, yeah, that's my own sort of take on the Gods and Earth's teachings in that respect. A lot of what, going back to Farrakhan, who of course is Nation of Islam, and the Gods and Earths and the 5%ers are a splinter group that came off of the Nation of Islam. But when you study a lot of what Farrakhan has to say in his sermons and lectures, and has done over the decades, it really does make a whole lot of sense. And he really does speak like somebody that absolutely understands the dynamics that are at play within this world. You know, he's very outspoken about the Illuminati, the New World Order, the elites of this world, and the way they seek to control the rest of us. He's been very outspoken about the Zionist regime and the stranglehold that they have over the business and political world and entertainment as well. And he has no problem speaking his mind about it. So, you know, so far so good in terms of him being a truth speaker. But there are some elements of Farrakhan's background which are highly questionable, and some of the teachings of Nation of Islam have been interpreted by many as hinging on racism. So it's very interesting. We're a couple of white dudes today talking about all this. But
yeah, exactly. Well,
it's a good thing to do.
I prefer to look at it, we're just a couple of human beings talking about it, but unfortunately the race thing is just always something that's being held in front of our faces, whether it's the media or just, you know, programming over the years. But what you just mentioned, this really kind of sets the tone for what we'll be talking about, where all those artists you talked about in the beginning, like half of those are the ones that I had the CDs for when I was growing up, you know? And this is my struggle with a lot of my own research with going through, you know, esoteric Freemasonry, theosophy, occultism, and stuff like that. There's a lot of very nice sounding ideas and doctrines and things that would seemingly be anti-New World Order in the context that I'd say the vast majority of the quote unquote truth movement kind of dishes out as to this is what the New World Order is, right? Satanic, black magic, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, you find all these weird, suspicious things going on with these people like Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam, once you really dig into it. And the whole Malcolm X thing, I think, is a really great example of that. But before we go all into that, this is just kind of the point. It's really hard to separate the quote-unquote good guys from the bad guys. It's just sort of like, okay, there's ideas, philosophies, and concepts. But to me, a lot of it is the root or core of you as a human and your intention and how you use that. So if you have a deceptive intention, you can say all the right things. You can say stuff that is inspiring and whatever, but what's the real motivation? And that's kind of like what I'd like to have everybody always keep in mind when we go through these things. We're not really giving an opinion per se on some of these doctrines or anything like that, but we're showing perhaps some red flags or some instances where things might not be what they seem. You think that's maybe a good assessment?
Well, we're asking questions that don't normally get asked, and we're dealing with elephants in the room. And when it comes to elephants in the room, you know, people don't like talking about them, and things that should be so obvious just never seem to get discussed. That's why I think there's a lot of value in this conversation we're having today. We're just getting it out on the table and giving people an opportunity to consider things that never normally get any kind of voice. Just going back to Farrakhan, I think the main thing that he's got hanging over him is this continual accusation of him having been complicit in the murder of Malcolm X. And he actually pretty much admitted to having been implicated in that thing just a few years ago. I found this article earlier online, which unfortunately doesn't have a year on it, but I do remember the story coming out, and I think it was somewhere around 4 or 5 years ago. So this article says Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan admits his complicity in the 1965 murder of Malcolm X while seated across the table from the civil rights leader's oldest daughter in a 60 Minutes interview to be broadcast May 14th. And he says, the quote that's been used is, Farrakhan says he helped create the atmosphere that led to Malcolm X's murder. And he's chatting with Atala Shabazz, Malcolm X's daughter. And there's an earlier story which I found dating back to 1995, which is titled Daughter of Malcolm X Charged with Trying to Kill Farrakhan. And it says his daughter at the time, his 4.5-year-old daughter, Kubila Bahila Shabazz, watched her father die in a hail of gunfire. Yesterday, Ms. Shabazz, who was 34 in 1995, was arrested in Minneapolis on federal charges of trying to hire a hitman to kill her father's Muslim disciple turned bitter rival, Louis Farrakhan, minister of the Nation of Islam. So that's the kind of millstone that's hanging around Farrakhan's neck, the fact that so many people charge him with being responsible in some way or complicit in the murder of Malcolm X, which is not looking too great for him, to be honest. So that's the major problem there. Just looking again at some of the influence of the 5% Nation, the Gods and Earths, on hip-hop culture, it turns out that many of the phrases that you would have heard these hip-hop MCs uttering in the 90s and which are still used to this day, even though what passes for hip-hop these days is nothing like what went before. Maybe we can go there at some point. I mean, the stuff that is passed off as hip-hop now is, I don't know what it is, but I can tell you what it's not, and it's not hip-hop or rap music in any way. But anyway, let's not digress onto that too early. So phrases such as peace, at the end of hip-hop records, you'd hear rappers saying peace to each other, peace God, peace son. So son, when they're referring to each other as son, they don't mean S-O-N, you're my son. It's not some put down. They're talking about son, S-U-N, the black man exalted as a son, as a god. The phrase word is bond, which you hear so many rappers using, that comes out of 5% teachings. And as I say, black people referring to each other as God. Maybe a spin-off of that is Jay-Z, who is a stated 5%er, referring to himself as Jehovah for a time, which many people interpret as great arrogance on his part. But, he's calling himself a god, basically. And we had a period where Kanye West referred to himself as Jesus, and that was equally controversial. But again, they're just exalting themselves as these godlike figures. Maybe that comes out of these doctrines and these teachings. And then you have aspects of hip-hop culture, such as the cypher, where you have a bunch of people forming a circle around a rapper who's dropping a freestyle. This is a big part of the culture that came out of the block parties and the hood communities where hip-hop grew up in New York in the early days. You would form a cypher, and rappers would jump into the middle of this circle and just bust some rhymes off the top of their heads and then pass it over to the next guy. So the whole idea of forming a cypher or a circle comes out of 5% teachings. Then you got the b-boy stance, the way hip-hop heads would stand and present themselves. That comes out of these teachings as well. And also the very rhythmic, eloquent way of speaking, which became a cornerstone of rapping. When you listen to a sermon by Farrakhan and other people like him, he actually sounds like a rapper. He's very articulate, and the rhythm of the speech is very, very reminiscent of what was going into the rhymes from these artists. The ministers of these movements are very gifted orators, so that's another aspect of Gods and Earths which has been brought into hip-hop culture. So all the stuff that I was getting into in those early days, which would be late 80s, early 90s, was influenced very much by this movement, which is basically a religious movement. And it struck me just recently that it's kind of like the de facto religion of hip-hop. Gods and Earths 5% teachings. In the same way that you get Rastafarianism all the way through reggae music, and you really can't listen to too many reggae records without them talking about Jah Rastafari and Haile Selassie and all this kind of stuff. And then you could take it to country music, and you could say they're constantly espousing Christianity, or at least on the surface, because when you get into the true nature of country, I think it's anything but Christian and anything but Jesus that they're revering. But at least on the glossy surface that's presented to the public, country music seems to be all about Christianity. So it's like these different music genres have their own religious movements that all the prominent artists adhere to. And that's what I think we've seen in hip hop all these years. So talk about elephants in the room, talk about things that don't get discussed but should. You know, it's shocking to me that I've missed so much of this over all these years.
Yeah, this is all very relative to my research, where it seems like every group gets this kind of spiritual underpinning attached to it, and the 5%er stuff, if you just kind of read the basic outline of it, it sounds very much like Freemasonry to me. And we can talk a little bit about KRS-One and him talking about Freemasonry in a little bit, but another interesting thing, we talk about the racial component. Some of the doctrines I've read in terms of alchemy and whatnot, there's this aspect, and again, this is their viewpoint, not mine. I'm not being racist here. I'm saying that they view the Negredo and alchemy, they have this more aspect, like Moor, which is traditionally known as African Americans, and that is utilized in this alchemy through some of the readings that I was looking at. I'm like, that's really weird. So I wonder if the controllers who are using this sort of alchemical system are actually in control of this 5% nation, and they just feed them this line about this racial superiority, and that's how they get them, and that's sort of like this ego thing. You know, that's kind of the way I think the quote unquote devil works in just a abstract kind of way, where it plays on your ego, right? So there seems to be a certain amount of ego along with all of this hip hop stuff to some extent, and certain people more than others. You talked about like Jay-Z and Jehovah kind of thing. And I just wonder if they're just, this whole 5%er is just, they're just having their strings pulled by another higher force. Or you could take the flip side and say that they are fighting that other force. But what we'll get into next with Africa and Bambaataa and whatnot, that might start to suggest that a lot of this is unraveling, and maybe some people who have been involved in this 5% thing are starting to see things very differently. Like people like, what's his name? Lord Jamar. Is that him? The brand Nubian guy? Yeah, I saw some interviews, him talking about the Africa Bambaataa thing, and he seemed like very puzzled by the whole thing, but he's still kind of stuck to his 5% kind of teachings. But it's let's get into that scandal, because that, I think, really quote unquote illuminates a lot of the hidden darker aspects to this, or potential darker aspects. So can you give a brief synopsis of the situation and who is Africa Bambaataa and what ended up happening recently to kind of possibly taint his image in that whole scene as a collective?
Sure. Well, I'll just preface that before we go into it by saying I'm now asking myself whether the whole cultural movement of hip-hop coming out of New York in the 1970s may have been intended as a vehicle for popularizing and normalizing 5% teachings among the black youth. Because again, when you have so many of these prominent MCs pushing these doctrines, this dogma, these ideas, you know, would that many of them really have just picked it up from each other and kind of inducted themselves of their own free will, versus was the whole thing a vehicle that was intended to promote this whole thing? You know, that's a question that I'm asking myself now. And of course, there's nothing wrong with religious or spiritual movements as long as the individuals following them have made that conscious decision for themselves, rather than having been coerced down that route by peer pressure or through the the leading artist of that scene's example.
And just being young, you know, a lot of these guys came up when they were like 16, 17, 18 years old into this. That's just something I want to throw in there real quick.
Well, that's true. And there would be a certain amount of young cats coming up in the game looking towards their elders as examples and taking on board their ideologies and thinking, yeah, this works for me. I'm going to incorporate this in my own life. But it seems to be all these key players. And I would have thought there would be a bit more individuality being shown where certain artists would say, well, no, this isn't for me. I'm not going down that route. I'm going to express myself in a different way. Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking out loud and asking this question generally. Was the whole hip-hop culture movement a vehicle for 5% of teachings? Was this scene selected to push this stuff out there? That's just a question I've got. So, you know, when all the big names on a scene are representing the same religious ideologies with no diversity, it smacks of being some kind of psyop or a controlled situation for me.
Cult-like behavior.
Well, yeah. And talking of cults, that leads us into this whole Bambaataa situation. So let's get into that. So Afrika Bambaataa, coming up as a hip-hop DJ myself, you're pretty much entrained to think of three individuals of almost godlike status. It's kind of part of your induction into, you know, being a DJ and being a part of that scene. And those three figures would be Afrika Bambaataa, Kool Herc, and Grandmaster Flash. So Kool Herc is generally held up as the originator of hip-hop. He's a DJ that came over from the Caribbean, and he had a sound system. He was a DJ that used to play soul and funk breaks, and he originated the idea of block parties where he would take turntables and a mixer out into the park and in the streets of various neighborhoods in the Bronx, usually power them up using street lamps, tapping into the electrical system of the street lamps, and he'd get all the kids from the neighborhood to come out and have this party, and would be spinning these soul and funk records and extending the breaks section, the breakdown section of these records where all the percussion was, and using these two turntables, two copies of the same record, to extend this break and these loops over and over for several minutes while these kids would dance to it, which is where the idea of b-boy dancing came from. So that whole way of doing things is attributed to Kool Herc, the founding father. Then you had this guy, Afrika Bambaataa, who is generally revered and held up as the originator of hip-hop culture. So whereas Kool Herc was all about the turntablist aspect of it, Bambaataa took it further by incorporating these other elements or bringing them all to the big picture, which includes the b-boying, the breaking, the graffiti aspect of it, the storytelling, the MC, the wordsmith, you know, which is the origins of rapping. And then all these different five elements of hip-hop were considered to come together in the fifth element, which is knowledge of self. And what we're really seeing here is like a different expression of the idea of the elements of earth, the four elements of earth, air, fire, water, coming together in the fifth element, which is spirit. It's a different expression of that, which was coming through these different aspects of hip-hop. This was broken down to me by a guy called Black Dot, who I interviewed for a podcast about 2 or 3 years ago. And I'd completely missed these spiritual components of the hip-hop game until he broke it down for me.
And that's all pretty much Freemasonry in a nutshell. Those sort of concepts. Right.
Well, you know, earth, air, fire, water, spirit is expressed in many sort of occult teachings and ideas, as you'll well be aware. So, yeah, Freemasonry certainly seems to be tied into that. Isn't that interesting? And then the third figure was Grandmaster Flash, who was also a turntablist DJ, and he's said to have perfected certain techniques of scratching and mixing, taking the mantle from Kool Herc and just taking that whole expression of turntablism to different levels. So Bambaataa is the figure that we're concerned with here. And his original name, his real name, is always given as Kevin Donovan. So you look him up on Wikipedia or any of the official online biographies about him, and he's said to have been called Kevin Donovan. But there's now some doubt as to whether that was actually his government name, because an alternative name that's come up in research is Lance Taylor. And there are other names that have been suggested for his true identity as well. So now we're left wondering who this guy really is. His official biography states that his mother and his uncle were political activists. And it's on record that he fell in with this street gang out of the South Bronx known as the Black Spades. And this group was supposed to be all about taking young males out of the community and inducting them into this group as a way of preventing them from falling in with more malevolent criminal type gangs. So they were saying, you join our number and we'll keep you out of trouble because we're all about espousing positivity. And there were spiritual teachings involved in that group as well. So again, we're into, the suggestion that it was some kind of religious movement or possibly a cult. Out of the Black Spades, you had an organization known as the Bronx River Organization, which was kind of an offshoot of it, in very similar ways to the 5% Nation Gods and Earths being an offshoot of Nation of Islam, actually. And so Bambaataa, the young Bambaataa, or Kevin Donovan or Lance Taylor, whatever he was called, kind of got into the Bronx River Organization, and that was renamed just the Organization after a short time. And then that, in turn, seems to have morphed into another offshoot, which became known as the Universal Zulu Nation. And Bambaataa was considered to be the founder of the Universal Zulu Nation. So the Zulu Nation grew in influence very quickly, and it established branches all over the US and in many countries around the world, to the point that just a few years ago it had a membership of several 100,000 members all over the world. So it's been very influential from those humble early beginnings. And again, this was supposed to be all about giving young, primarily male members of the community an opportunity to stay out of criminal behaviors and criminal lifestyles by channeling their energies into something more positive and more constructive. That was the philosophy and the ethos of the Zulu Nation, at least on the surface. But Bambaataa established these gangs at a very young age. In 1973, he's supposed to have been a part of the Bronx River Organization, and he was only 16 years of age at that time. And when you consider the massive influence and impact that the Zulu Nation has come to have under his guidance for many years, although he was actually replaced as leader of the Zulu Nation in 1994. So, he's not been in place for quite some years, but it grew under his leadership to these massive proportions. And you've got to ask yourself how a kid from the street, if that's all he was, can yield that much power and sway and influence over so many people. But anyway, he was revered and kind of worshipped in the hip-hop game as this founding father figure for many years, and everything was rosy up until the spring of 2016. And in April of that year, a couple of individuals came forward accusing Bambaataa of having sexually molested them on an ongoing basis, dating all the way back to the late 70s and early 80s. You had this guy, Ronald Savage, who was a member of the Universal Zulu Nation. He was known by the street name Bee Stinger. And at the same time as he came forward with these accusations, you had another guy by the name of Hassan Campbell, who was known as Poppy, who similarly accused Bambaataa of having, sexually abused him on an ongoing basis. So suddenly you got these two devastating accusations coming out. And initially there was denial on the part of Bambaataa and the Zulu Nation, as you'd probably expect, probably hoping the whole thing would go away. But Ronald Savage, who's now a politician and an author and a business leader, recorded a conversation that he had on the telephone with a member of the Universal Zulu Nation who called him up and offered him money to retract his statement about Bambaataa. And he put the phone call on YouTube. You can actually listen to it on there. And initially, I think the guy mentions a figure of $50,000 to keep quiet and retract this story. And Savage makes it clear that he's not interested in money. He just wants justice for victims of sexual abuse. Unfortunately, there's a statute of limitations present in New York which prevents any alleged victims of sexual abuse being able to press charges against those that they accuse after their 23rd birthday. And naturally, the 23rd birthday of these two guys is long since past, so they can't actually press any legal charges against Bambaataa. But you had a bunch of other figures in the hip-hop scene that were jumping up and having their say about this whole situation in the wake of these accusations. Oh, and by the way, 2 more men came forward after Savage and Campbell as well, accusing Bambaataa of having been a predatory paedophile. And there were also individuals who had been within the leadership of the Zulu Nation who came forward to confirm that Bambaataa's paedophilic tendencies were well known within the organization, but they were kind of a secret that nobody spoke about, an open secret. And when I heard that kind of talk, my mind went straight to the situation we had with Jimmy Savile here in the UK, when the story broke in October 2012 of him having been a prolific serial paedophile that abused many, many kids over decades. And much of it happened on BBC TV premises, it would seem, where he was employed. And so many people within the BBC, when this news broke, and the public was absolutely shocked to the core that this guy that had always been presented as a national treasure was in fact a disgusting paedophile. All these other members of the BBC, other household name presenters were coming forward saying, well, yeah, we all kind of knew about it. It was like an open secret in the corporation, but nobody spoke about it. You just knew that you weren't supposed to raise it. So you had people like Terry Wogan saying this, and Bill Oddie, and Esther Ranson, and all these other household name BBC presenters. So here we've got leadership from the Universal Zulu Nation coming forward and saying, well, yeah, we kind of knew about Bambaataa, but, you know, what can you do? One of the guys that came forward accusing him of this type of activity and confirming what Hassan Campbell and Ronald Savage had said was a guy by the name of T.C. Islam. And he was, for some time, a sort of minister of propaganda or information or a spokesperson for the Universal Zulu Nation. And he came out last year in an interview with this lady called Layla Wills, who is an investigative journalist. She's based in Chicago, and she works on a newspaper called Metropolis. And she's working on a documentary, which is due to be released sometime this year. Can't wait for that to drop. She's called it Trapped in a Culture. And there's capitalization of the words rap cult within that phrase, because she's of the view that the Universal Zulu Nation was in fact a kind of mind control cult. So anyway, she secured an interview with this guy, T.C. Islam, and he's talking about how he tried to do something about Bambaataa's known paedophilic activities way back in the day, and he tried to raise this issue with the elders of the Zulu Nation. You see how this whole thing is structured? They had elders and like councils, and there would be a hierarchy that you'd have to go through to get decisions made and get things heard. So this is more than just a street gang. Street gangs don't organize themselves in this way. So anyway, T.C. Islam made these comments about the fact that he had tried to raise this issue many, many years ago, but he says on this interview with Layla Wills, which is going to appear in her documentary, I would have been killed. Well, the next thing that happened was T.C. Islam turned up dead on the 8th of June last year in Atlanta. His body was discovered on a sidewalk, having been shot. And there are a couple of guys, a couple of, sort of street criminals that have been arrested, and one of them has been charged with his murder. Whether this is what really happened to him, or whether it was just this random street crime, or there's more to it to know, we can only speculate. But that's the situation at the moment.
Well,
so TC Islam.
Oh, sorry. I was just looking up an article real quick on it, and the article says that he had been receiving threats from Zulu Nation. I don't know if that's true or not.
Right.
But just before he shot, getting threats, that's very suspicious.
Well, it is, and then he just happens to get shot by a couple of street hoods, bad luck. So TC Islam, would appear to be a murder victim implicated in this whole Bambaataa Universal Zulu Nation mess. So Bambaataa pretty much went on the run when this story really started to get out of hand. You had this guy, Star, this presenter known as Star, who's got a YouTube channel called Shot 97. Used to work on The Breakfast Show on Hot 97. And now he's branched out on his own, and he's covered this whole story right since day one. So he's had Ronald Savage and Hassan Campbell on many times. He's spoken to Lord Jamar of Brand Nubian, who's weighed in with his views on the whole thing. Other rappers have come forward as well. And so he's covered the whole story. And he's covered the TC Islam element of it as well. And I just lost my train of thought. I forgot where I was going with this.
It's okay. Well, I can chime in with a few things in response. It's cool that you keep up with this because you're telling me I didn't know about this TC Islam guy. I just looked him up, and that makes it all the more suspicious. And some of the stuff that I've looked at, Lord Jamar, I saw an interview with him, and he was saying, because first Africa Bambaataa denied knowing Bee Stinger, right?
That's right.
And so Jamar was basically saying, like, everybody knew who Bee Stinger was, and he was just like, you know, in the studio and whatever, and Bambaataa would be going through. And basically Jamar was saying, like, how could he have not known who he was? And so that's pretty strange when you have these allegations that are pretty serious. And again, I completely understand to you know, have a level of, you know, balance here, that somebody could make an accusation of somebody being a pedophile and that will just taint them even if they didn't do it. So I understand, like, there might be revenge motivations and stuff like that aren't actually true. But when you start denying that you knew people, if it wasn't a true allegation, why would you even deny it? Be like, oh yeah, I knew Bee Stinger. He had some problems with me, so he's just making this up. He chose to pretend like he didn't know him. And then it came out later that he did. Now, did he ever acknowledge that he knew him eventually, or did he always say that he didn't know who he was?
I don't believe he acknowledged it. Shortly after that, Bambaataa went on the run, which is where I was going with that last train of thought, and I've kind of lost it. So yeah, Bambaataa went off the scene and nobody knew his whereabouts for a very long time. So does that strike you as the actions of someone who's innocent and has got nothing to hide and is going to stand their ground and defend themselves? Or does it strike you as someone who has got something to hide? So he was sort of on the run for quite some time, and he popped back up very recently in November of 2017, a couple of months ago, in Brazil. So he was scheduled to do a couple of shows, one in Sao Paulo and one in Rio de Janeiro. And the promoters of the Sao Paulo show seemingly were oblivious to all this scandal that had blown up in the US, because they were promoting this gig as, oh, this wonderful figure, you know, the founding father of hip hop culture, the legend, the man, the myth, Afrika Bambaataa, come and see him at this show. And shortly after that, somebody must have had a friendly word with them, because that show was cancelled. But the show in Rio went ahead. And I've seen some video footage on YouTube of Bambaataa down in Rio, in a bar with a couple of other guys, having a drink, having a laugh, loving life, living it up, you know. So you've got these very serious accusations against him. You got the phone call from somebody trying to pay off Ronald Savage to keep quiet. It's looking not too great for Bambaataa. And yet he's still roaming around a free man with, as far as I know, no kind of police intervention into his activities.
And he has KRS-One defending him, right?
Well, that's right. So
has he changed his stance in that at all, or has he pretty much said what he said and left it at that? I'm curious.
He has left it at that. So KRS-One was one of the names that chimed in with his take on the whole Bambaataa situation. So very early on, when Bambaataa was first being accused by these two guys, KRS-One just was asked about it in an interview, and he basically said, I don't give a fuck if he did it or not. He said it takes nothing away from him. It doesn't take anything away from his legacy and his achievements. And if you've got a problem with Bambaataa, you should get out of hip-hop. That's basically it. So he's saying that if you want to be a part of the fabric of hip-hop culture and be a part of that game, then you've got to accept Bambaataa as a kind of de facto figurehead and godlike figure within it. And if you can't do that, you don't belong in hip-hop.
Yeah, I saw the interview with him about that, and then he did another interview to kind of clarify his original statement. And
exactly.
I sort of saw his side a little bit on certain issues, but when he starts to say that the leaders have to be infallible and you can't criticize the leaders, I'm like, what? Like, there was, you know, like, he sort of redeemed a couple aspects of it, I thought, in that interview, but still the fundamental issues it was just like, okay, this guy's, I don't know, he's either just doesn't want to believe at all, and or maybe he's got some hidden secrets. I don't really know, but on KRS-One, he's also made some comments about how he'd be considered a 33rd degree Mason, and I think in that interview he was talking about how the real leaders of the world, which I think he was basically alluding to the 5%ers, are righteous and whatnot. And I'm sure you've seen that interview, so if you want to elaborate a little bit on KRS-One's background, his ties to a lot of this esoteric stuff, feel free.
Sure. So KRS did a bit of kind of backtracking after that initial statement. So when he said, I don't give a fuck if he did it or not, it takes nothing away from him, I think that comment was made in the heat of the moment without too much thought being given to it. And it created quite a bit of a stir. And people were saying KRS-One doesn't care about victims of sexual abuse and this is insensitive. I mean, Poppy Hassan Campbell has come out and said that KRS-One, as a father, not caring whether this guy that he's defending was into the sexual abuse of kids, makes him a lousy father, and the best thing he could do is go and kill himself. Well, these are some of the comments that are coming out now. Mm-hmm. And in my book, I've drawn attention to a track which KRS-One released with Boogie Down Productions called 13 many years ago. And it's one of these storytelling tracks. And he's relating having picked up this girl in a club, and she's young and hot and horny, and he wants to get her home and do the nasty. And he says to her, how old are you? You know, you're 21, 19? And she giggles and says, I'm 13. In the lyrics, he says, 13? Damn, that's statutory rape. But then he says, I took her home and boy, she was good.
Oh, boy.
He finds out this girl is 13 and he thinks, damn, that's statutory rape.
But it's just art, Mark, okay? It's okay if it's art.
Yeah. And people will say, well, it's just a record, you know, it's just an imaginary scenario in the lyrics. But, you know, putting all this stuff together doesn't look too great. Yeah. So anyway, KRS did a bit of backpedaling, and he then attempted to say that he does indeed care whether Bambaataa was into this stuff or not and committed these crimes. But what he was trying to say is it takes nothing away from his achievements, and you know, he's still this legendary figure within hip hop culture, and we owe him so much. So he's kind of trying to frame it in that way. KRS-One has a vested interest and ulterior motives in the continuation of hip hop culture being held up as this wonderful thing that we've all felt it to be over the years, because he's got a career as a teacher, like a spiritual teacher. He's actually known as KRS-One the Teacher, and he refers to himself that way on many tracks. And he established the Temple of Hip Hop, which is another of these quasi-religious movements. And he espouses all these different spiritual, metaphysical teachings of hip hop that I mentioned earlier. And he gives lectures and holds seminars, and he's published books on it. So, you know, he has a vested interest in all this stuff continuing unscathed and not being tarred with this particular brush. He's also known as the Blast Master, of course. So you've got the master aspect there. And when you look into the naming of some of these early prominent figures, such as Grandmaster Flash, and there are many other, Grandmaster Melly Mel, there's lots of references to masters in some of these early namings of the acts. And you alluded earlier to the idea that we may be looking at aspects of Freemasonry here. And it really does give some reinforcement to that idea, I feel. Is that what we've been looking at from the very early days of this whole movement and all these different groups within it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Like, you think all of these titles and whatnot, oh, it's just kind of cool names and whatever. But, you know, when you look at some of these esoteric societies, and I've looked in some rituals like Golden Dawn rituals and whatnot, and they have these sort of different titles for people, and it's all this initiatory system. You go through different grades, you go to the next level of quote unquote awareness or consciousness, and you know, that's it sounds all nice and cool, but at the same time, that's a great way to compartmentalize things and keep people in the dark. And you know, having this grand mystery around it, and you don't really know what's going on, it's kind of intimidating to want to speak out about things, because especially if there are oaths involved, which as far as I've read in like Albert Pike and Manly Palmer Hall, if you violate those oaths, you're going to have some punishment, and sometimes that punishment is death. So you add all that in together with this, and then you see somebody like, what's his name, TC Islam, getting killed. You wonder if that is part of what's going on. There's an esoteric society that's kind of, all this 5% stuff is under another umbrella, and they are just kind of pawns in it all. I don't know. Those are just some things I think about.
Yeah. Well, in this upcoming documentary from Layla Wills, Trapped in a Culture, Rap Cult, she's obviously putting forward the idea that the Universal Zulu Nation has been run as some kind of mind control cult. And when you consider the way that these groups are run, known cults, it's always different members of the same family getting inducted into the ranks. Then you have people within the group are encouraged not to fraternize with people outside of the group, but only to maintain friendships and relationships within the membership. And then you have a hierarchy, a chain of command. And you have to go up the chain with any kind of issues or grievances or anything you want resolved. And all of that stuff has been present in the Universal Zulu Nation. It's definitely a hierarchy, and it bears all the hallmarks of being a kind of mind control cult. And if it hadn't been for Savage and Campbell coming out with these accusations against Bambaataa in 2016, maybe we wouldn't be asking these kind of questions. Maybe that organization would be considering continuing just as it had for all those decades, business as usual, no reason to suspect anything was up. Maybe we're only having this conversation today because of those guys being courageous enough to come forward and opening this whole Pandora's box and getting it all out into the open. It's just a thought.
Yeah, well, let's go into some of the other figures that kind of lend to a lot of the red flags surrounding this. The Bambaataa thing, I think, is just like the House of Cards kind of falling situation, where now let's go into some individual cases where there's weird stuff, but it wasn't really enough to say that, there's something greater going on in terms of, a very obvious sort of a manipulative force. I wanted to talk a bit about, let's go to Guru from Gang Starr. I used to have a few of his albums, and I really liked the Jazzmatazz albums, but apparently, from what I've heard you talk about, those seem to be some of the albums he was maybe the most controlled on, which, kind of like makes me like, oh man. But, what's his main story, and what was the figure that came into his life that kind of may have been a manipulator or a handler?
Right. Well, Guru was always one of my favorite MCs. I loved his lyricism. The track Moment of Truth that Gang Starr put out from that 1998 album was just really spoke to me in a very profound way. I just love the sentiments that he's putting forward on that track. They also put out a track called Conspiracy in 1992, where he's talking about how the music industry and the rap industry in particular is completely controlled by an elite ruling class, and they try and screw the artist over and keep them down and keep all the profits for themselves. And he's talking about the way society is organized in that way. So he's dropping some great truth bombs there, and was throughout his recording career. So in the early days of Gang Starr, it was Guru alongside DJ Premier, who is a producer that I've always respected because he's one that has never really sold out. He's always continued to make very solid, hard-hitting beats, and he's not gone down the same route as certain other producers in terms of getting down with the program of commercialism. So it was a very solid outfit, Gang Starr, for many years. I actually met Guru in 1999. I was in Fat Beats record store in Amsterdam, and I'm there among the vinyl, looking at records, and just across from me is Guru doing some record shopping. I thought I recognized him, and I went over. I said, "Excuse me, are you Guru?" And he said, "Yeah, man." And I said, oh, I'm a DJ from the UK. I love your stuff. And he said, yeah, I'm just, in Amsterdam picking up some records. And down in the basement of this store, the guys that ran it had a little radio studio. They did a show from there each week. And they brought Guru down to do a show. And I went and sat in on it. And being Amsterdam, obviously there were a lot of spliffs being smoked and a lot of hip-hop music being played. And that was quite a memorable encounter with the guy. So it was very devastating for me to come to terms with his demise in 2010. Guru came from a very unlikely background for a rapper. He didn't come from the mean streets of some projects or whatever. His father was actually a judge, and he hailed from Boston. And he was basically part of quite a middle-class, well-to-do family. But he came down to New York, hooked up with Premier, who had come in from Texas, and established himself as a producer in New York. And these two formed the Gangstar Foundation. And they brought a bunch of other artists through as well, like Bumpy Knuckles and who was that other guy? Freddie Fox and Big Shug. That's right. Big Shug was one of the founding members of Gangstar alongside Premier as well. Mm-hmm. So I loved that group's output. But somewhere along the way, Guru and Premier had a big falling out, and Gangstar split. And Guru started doing this series of Jazzmatazz albums, which was him exploring his love of original jazz music and fusing it with new hip-hop production styles. And I can't remember how many Jazzmatazz albums he put out, but it was probably 4 or 5. And within the process of putting those out, he hooked up with a producer known as Super Producer, his words, not mine, Solar. Solar. So not to be confused with a French hip-hop MC called MC Solar with 2 A's. This guy Solar, his real name was John Mosher. And he started producing Guru's albums. And fans immediately started commenting about the decline in production standards of Guru's material. They were pointing out that Solar was no Premier, and he was not bringing out the best in Guru. He was not making good beats. But Guru persisted with him. As the years pressed on, it started to get more alarming in terms of the influence and control that Solar seemed to be having over Guru. So there were people complaining about the fact that they would book Guru for an interview, and he would turn up with Solar, and Solar would come in on the interview and answer half the questions for him without giving Guru a chance to speak. And people were getting pissed off about that. And Guru would always defend him by saying, oh, he's my homeboy, he's my manager, my mentor, whatever, and where I go, he goes. And it started to look as if Solar was in some way a kind of mind control handler of Guru. And Guru's behavior started to become more erratic and unpredictable, and he slipped into alcoholism, sadly. This was apparently a problem that he'd had all his life. And, he just fell down that hole. And there was a very quick decline, and his health started to suffer to the point that by 2010, he'd been hospitalized with various conditions. And all the while that he was in hospital, there were accusations of Solar having accessed his bank accounts and accessed his online social media profiles, passing himself off as Guru and chatting up women and, trying to have sex with them. All under the name of Guru.
Classy.
He also gained control of all of Guru's financial affairs and got himself signed over as his, what's the word? I forget the word. When you sign somebody over as your financial benefactor, basically. So Solar had a major control over Guru's life. And it's all very strange. You've got to ask yourself why any rational human being in control of their own senses would allow somebody to come in and exert this much control over their life. So anyway, in the last days of his life, Guru had slipped into a coma. And family members were being prevented from coming and visiting him at the hospital by Solar, who said that Guru had signed a letter stating that he, Solar, was to be the prime and sole executor of his business affairs, and that he didn't want family members coming to visit him. And naturally, the family was outraged at this, not least because Guru's father was a judge, and knew a bit about such things, Guru's cousin went very public with a bunch of interviews talking about how Solar was behaving and talking about how he'd become a leech and a really bad influence on Guru's life. There was a website which sprung up, and it was put together by fans of Guru that were trying to get some justice for him and trying to figure out what was going on. And it was called fucksolar.com. And Solar must have had friends in high places because he was able to get that website shut down. And every time there was a comment online saying Solar is a bad influence on Guru and justice is going to be done and he's going to be pulled up for this, Solar would very confidently and arrogantly reply to the comment by saying, things like, you don't know who you're messing with, you can't touch me, you're talking shit, let's see what happens, bring it on, do your best, all this kind of thing. So he was speaking with a great deal of confidence, like somebody who knows they've got protection would speak. And then Guru eventually passed away, and those that did get to see him in the hospital spoke of how he had a big clumped afro on his head and his fingernails were unkempt and hadn't been cut for months, and he was just in a terrible state. And to this day, there's been no justice served against Solar. There's been no legal case brought against him. He has kind of faded into obscurity. There aren't that many rappers who seem to be in that much of a rush to work with him. Can't think why. And his career since then hasn't exactly distinguished him. But it's very strange how those were the final days of Guru. Many commentators on the whole situation have spoken of how Solar seemed to have a kind of magical, black magic sort of effect on him. And they're speculating on whether there was some kind of voodoo type activity that was going on, because Guru was acting like he was the subject of a curse. It certainly looks that way in terms of the way his final days panned out. And really, you get a lot of commentary and speculation about people like Biggie and Tupac, and people even talk about Jam Master Jay and Old Dirty Bastard and some of these other rappers that have passed away at untimely ages. But you never really hear Guru discussed. There are very few instances where this situation gets brought up. You never really see videos about it, and you don't see it discussed in chat forums and such. He's very much the forgotten artist when it comes to his sad demise, and I think that's pretty tragic concerning some of the great music and some of the uplifting messages that he put into the world.
Yeah, he was definitely one of the more underground people. I mean, Biggie and Tupac, those guys were, just everywhere. But speaking of them, next I'd like to move on to Tupac and Biggie, since we just kind of talked about them a little bit. For me, I just wonder, what do you think was the point of the whole East Coast, West Coast feud? And even some of the things like Tupac had a song, I remember, Hit 'Em Up, where he basically calls out Mobb Deep and Biggie and Puff Daddy and the whole entourage and record label, right, Bad Boy and whatnot. Do you think that this was like a legitimate quote unquote beef, or was there's this something engineered by, the record companies and perhaps a hidden esoteric hand in doing that? And the only thing I'll add from my end is this seems very suspicious to me, with this whole polarizing two sides, creating some conflict or chaos, and then the controllers utilize that in the alchemical process and kind of synthesize it how they want. So to me, I'm already kind of suspicious when I see these, like, this side versus this side. But what do you make of that whole situation?
I don't for a minute believe that it was in any way authentic or organic. And I'm with you in that any kind of scenario which emerges like this to foment discord between two sides and divide and conquer is straight out of a social engineer's rule book. And it served the controllers very well to have these two sides fighting it out, and people going down on one side or the other, culminating in the violent deaths of these two iconic figures. And I'm well aware that there are some that claim their deaths may be a hoax. And of course, we get that every time a celebrity passes away. Certain researchers will say this is just a hoax event, and they're going off to live out the rest of their lives out of the public spotlight somewhere. Yes, it remains a possibility, but in this case, I do go for the official version of things, which is that Biggie and Tupac were taken out. It goes back to a subject area that I've talked about big time throughout 2017, and it's going to figure majorly in my talks of this year and indeed the book, which is culture creation and lifetime actors and social engineering and how that whole thing gets done. So whenever you have any kind of movement, fad, trend, culture, which sweeps up large numbers of people and gets them thinking in a certain way, behaving in a certain way, adopting different belief systems, different values, different perceptions, then that won't have been allowed to have evolved on its own naturally, because we've got an elite control system that would not allow that. They have to be in control of everything of that magnitude which occurs. And they have groups and agencies which specialize in making sure culture goes off in desired directions. That's why I'm asking all these big questions now about hip-hop culture generally and the Universal Zulu Nation and the overall influence of the Gods and Earth's 5% Nation, because it does involve very large numbers of people. It's into the millions in terms of the fans that have lapped this stuff up, factored in alongside the vast numbers of individuals that have been involved in this stuff in the industry. So really being honest with ourselves and coming with some understanding of how society is structured and how this control system that we have likes to operate and has done for centuries, do we really believe that this whole scene would have been allowed to go off in its own way without being controlled at every turn? And it's probably pretty clear what I think about that. So addressing the Biggie and Tupac situation and the whole East Coast, West Coast beef within that context, it absolutely smacks of having been a manufactured setup from the start. And it reminds me of the JFK assassination as it was portrayed in Oliver Stone's movie, where you didn't get a straight answer as to what the prime motive was for the event and what the single group or entity was that was involved. So you walk away from that movie with the idea that it was partly the CIA. There was some FBI black ops involvement. There was some involvement from organized crime, the mafia. There was some involvement probably from international banksters. There was involvement from the communists. And it just becomes a huge tangled mess. And nobody can say with any certainty which one party may have instigated this whole thing. So with the East Coast, West Coast beef, it would appear to have been to foment discord among the black community. And there would appear to have been input from different factions like the LA and Vegas police departments, who just don't seem to be able to catch anyone 20 odd years later for two murders that occurred in two of the busiest strips in the world, with hundreds of people in attendance. Then you get constant accusations of organized crime groups being involved, the mafia and, different other organizations. The FBI's COINTEL program is never far from the surface in terms of what people say about the true motive. And Tupac is supposed to have been on an FBI watch list due to his activism and all of this. And then some personal complicity on the parts of Puffy and Suge Knight. You can't really have a conversation about what happened to Biggie and Tupac without those two guys' names coming up. So, people point to the fact that Puffy chose to ride in a separate car to Biggie on that fateful night, which is very fortunate for him. Suge Knight was in the car in which Tupac got shot up, and he's supposed to have taken a fragment of a bullet himself. But, who knows? It just becomes a tangled mess, and I can't really see any straight answer as to which group may have pulled this whole thing off. In terms of the aim, as I said, it was to foment discord and divide within the black community, but it also seems to be symbolic of the moral and cultural decline of hip-hop from that point on. So many people that I've spoken to cite 1997, the year of Biggie's murder, as the beginning of the decline in standards in hip-hop in terms of lyrics and production styles. So maybe there was some kind of occult ritualistic element to it as well, because we know that the controllers that we have play the long game, and they know years and decades in advance where they're going to take a certain program. And when we look at what so-called hip-hop has become now, which I describe as straight up satanic in terms of the way the records sound, the frequencies and the styles of production that are going into these records. It's all electronic, it's all digital. Who knows what kind of stuff is being loaded into these records. And you look at the utterly degraded and debased lyrical content where you've got so-called artists just talking about, you know, partying and champagne and doing Molly and running guns, selling drugs, bitches, hoes, niggers, all of this. It's just so utterly spiritually debased and degraded that I think that has been a long-term plan to take it in that direction. And maybe there's some kind of symbolic relevance to the fact that these lyrical standards started to decline round about the time of Biggie and Tupac being taken out.
Yeah.
That's just my thoughts on it.
Well, it's interesting because like Biggie and Tupac's music had elements of that, but at the same time, they're like Tupac had a lot of. It was weird. I remember like he had the song. I can't remember. It was I think it was. I can't remember. It was about some girl who was basically.
Brenda's Got a Baby.
No, it was about the girl who was like basically a prostitute, and I can't remember the name, but Wonder Why They Call You Bitch. That's it.
Okay.
And it was like sort of a positive message in the way that like it was a story of seeing this woman, you know, being like this, you know, quote unquote club skank, and he's like saying you're better than that, and you should go to enroll in school and show all these people. But then she ends up getting AIDS and dying. So it's like a sort of like a sad commentary on watching that. So it's weird. There's like kind of positive things mixed in with like, you know, to live and die in LA and drinking Alizé and Hennessy and stuff like that. So, but then it went into full throttle. Like that was all it was. It's just bitches and hoes. And like, to me, like really when that started taking over is like the whole like 50 Cent kind of stuff started coming in, and especially like the No Limit people and stuff, and Lil Wayne is just like the worst culmination of all of that. And but in that time I remember, because I was like late high school when all this happened, or mid high school I think, and I always joked about how I was like, you know what, I bet Puff Daddy like killed Biggie just to make money off that "I'll Be Missing You" song. It was kind of a joke, but now I look back and I'm like, I wonder what really happened there, because that song just got like thrown out really quickly.
Right.
It almost.
Well, you know
go ahead.
You know the sleeve to Biggie's Life After Death album.
No.
The strange business of him being in a funeral suit next to a hearse.
Oh no, I remember that now. Yeah.
Yeah. So the whole theme of that album, which turned out to be his last album, was based around a funeral. And in my first book, I cite an interview with this art director that was called on by Puffy to do the series of photographs that was used on that sleeve. And he says they were running around New York trying different locations out to see what worked. And they were taking all kinds of photos out in the open, in cityscapes, and Biggie was doing all these different poses. And just as part of that, they decided to take a couple of shots in a cemetery with Biggie in a funeral suit with his cane next to a hearse. And this art director says Puffy insisted on that. And he said the whole mood of the day and this photo shoot they'd been doing got very dark and very kind of dismal at that point. And then he says Puffy selected the pictures that had been taken in the cemetery as the ones that he wanted to use for the album sleeve. And when you factor in what happened to Biggie very shortly after that, it starts to look a little suspicious. Mm-hmm. And then you can put that side by side with the Tupac Don Columinati sleeve, Machiavelli, where he's being crucified. So it's depicting his death. And that came out shortly before what happened to Tupac. So that would appear to be two aspects of what's known as predictive programming when it comes to the fate of those two artists. And it becomes very strange indeed.
Yeah, not to mention Sting was involved in that song, and he had that whole performance with him. I believe they were on stage together. And we don't have to get into Sting, but he's one of those people who seems to crop up in a lot of this musician, being involved in more esoteric societies and underpinnings. But back to Tupac. To me, it seemed like he had a seemingly anti-New World Order message, and perhaps that's kind of in line with what we talked about with the Nation of Islam stuff, because I just saw some articles where he seems to get praise from the Zulu Nation and the Africa Bambaataa crowd, and then he called himself Machiavelli, which seems like an allusion to Machiavelli, who apparently inspired a lot of these ends justify the means ideas, and I think that those are really at the heart of the New World Order. And then you have him depicted as Christ in that final album you're talking about, and then you were talking about the JFK assassination. A lot of my research around that has to do with like this death and resurrection motif, which ties into a lot of the rituals of like Hiram Abiff or Osiris and Freemasonry and whatnot. And then I think it's interesting how MTV produced a film called Resurrection on Tupac's life in 2003. So he has like this Christ motif, and then MTV resurrects him in this film. And of course, MTV must be involved in all of this. And so the lines get blurred with this so-called anti-New World Order message, but then we have MTV resurrecting him and making him look like a hero. And it's the same thing with JFK. We have a movie about him. It's a Hollywood movie. I mean, I love the movie JFK, but like, it's kind of weird. Like you said, you get this conspiracy version of it, and it's all packaged in this movie, but it's Hollywood. So how can you not have red flags around it? And this is where I kind of get lost in all this, where, okay, I can kind of see the hoax of theory. Like, I can see that side of it, but at the same time, it's just like, I need a lot more to go on than just that idea. And I just, this is where I just get confused, and I just know that at least there's something rotten about all of this. And that's kind of where I'm at with it. I think it's interesting discussing it, but it's really hard to just pinpoint any sort of cohesive idea of what actually happened. And I guess that's probably part of the plan all along from the people orchestrating all these things.
Well, there's a real dichotomy with Tupac, and it becomes impossible to say with any certainty what he was all about, whether he was genuine, what agenda he may have been serving. You made the point that so many artists appear to put out records which are positive and empowering and have some kind of message for humanity. And you can apply that to pretty much every music act, even the ones who have very suspect affiliations in their real lives. I mean, even Bono, for God's sake. Bono is such a stooge and a bloody foot soldier of the New World Order that you don't even need any further discussion on the subject. You can just look up some pictures of him hobnobbing with Obama and Bill Clinton and Bill Gates, and it's pretty obvious what Bono is. And yet you'll still find him making records that appear to be him giving empowering messages to humankind. And all artists do this. Again, many of the ones that are undeniably products of military intelligence came out with records like that. The Who were almost certainly products of British military intelligence, MI5, MI6, Tavistock Institute, made records like Won't Get Fooled Again, where they're talking about the number that's done on the public by social engineers and the way we're all duped and deceived. And yet, they've got these affiliations in the background. It's the same with the Grateful Dead and the Doors, who were two groups who were absolutely products of the CIA. Even the Police, involving Sting, who you just mentioned. The Police were the creation of the Copeland family. Miles Copeland Sr. was a legendary CIA agent.
Yeah, that blew my mind when I heard that.
Yeah, and his three sons got put to use in the music industry, and yet you find Sting and the Police putting out these apparently positive, incredible messages to empower us. So you get that with all artists. And it was certainly the case with Tupac. So you had certain records, Brenda's Got a Baby, social commentary. He's talking real talk, stuff that other artists don't want to discuss. But at the same time, he'll put out a record like Hit 'Em Up, where he's talking about he wants to murder everyone. He wants to murder Mobb Deep, and he wants to murder Biggie and Tupac. And he had sex with Faith Evans, Biggie's wife, and all this. And you think, how do you balance these different aspects of him? So on the one hand, you hear that he was an activist. You hear that the whole thug life thing the acronym is supposed to have stood for "The hate you give little infants fucks everyone." I'm not sure I buy that acronym. And you hear that he was trying to unite all the street gangs, and he was trying to warn everyone of how we're all controlled by the Illuminati. And there was always this legend that the FBI had a price on his head, and he was constantly on the run and under surveillance and getting locked up on some trumped up charges or other, fake rape charges and all of that. But you do have to wonder whether that could have been some kind of credible cover story, because there's other aspects to him as well. Like I say, he was putting out these violent, misogynistic, destructive lyrics, and every time he would put out a track that was apparently empowering, he'd come along with another one where he's talking about bitches, hoes, and niggers, you know. And Hit 'Em Up itself definitely served to further intensify that whole East Coast, West Coast beef. You know, that was very much a catalyst for a lot of people getting very high emotions and getting very upset about the whole thing. And something that I think we should consider and bear in mind is the fact that Tupac was, of course, a trained actor. He's on the record as having attended acting school.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah, when he was in Baltimore. So the family, his mother, Afeni Shakur.
Well, he wasn't Above the Rim, the movie, I remember.
Right.
And he was really good in it.
Yeah, he was a great actor.
Birdie the Gangster.
Yeah, he was a trained actor, so he went to stage school. And this brings in lifetime actors, of course, which is, again, a concept that I get into a lot. And it occurred to me when I was doing some research this week that what do we call bands and groups and individual musicians? What's the catch-all term that they're referred to as? Well, you quite often hear them called acts. They're a music act. And it just occurred to me that, yeah, pretty much everything they do is an act. You're not getting the real them. Maybe you're not getting a sincere message from them. Maybe it is all an act. Because, again, those that control all these aspects of human life don't leave it to chance what messages are going to get out there and what individuals get big and influential. Maybe it is all an act. So with Tupac, who knows? I mean, I'd love to give you a straight answer, man, but I'm just as confused as anyone.
Well, it's funny you mention that because just a quick personal side note. I remember when I was in high school for my psychology class, we took a trip to the Dannemora prison, which is where he stayed. Just to, for the psychological nature of the prison system. And I remember some of the guards, of course, us being kids, we had to ask the guards about Tupac. And one of the guards remembered him. And he basically said that he was like a bullshitter or like a fake tough guy or something like that. This is just the prison guard's opinion. I don't know. Maybe the prison guard was just trying to give us a story. I don't really know. And this is a long time ago, but I just specifically remember him saying that he thought that Tupac was like kind of a fraud in terms of like his persona or something like that. And I don't know, take it for what you will, but I always remember that. And then in relation to what you're talking about, these nice sounding ideas and activism and whatnot and philanthropy, this reminds me a lot of the United Nations, and that's what a lot of my research is based upon, where they have their own spiritual foundation, which is following Madame Blavatsky's teachings, and that's all the esoteric understanding of Lucifer and whatnot. And then the UN is supposed to be this, philanthropic organization that's bringing world peace, blah, 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 blah. But then you start seeing all of these sordid things that they're involved in, like the whole taking out of Gaddafi and whatnot, and this all pretty much lines in with this whole polarity where they make a fake bad guy, they prop themselves up as the good guy, and this is just how the occultists work. And so, where the line gets blurred and how many people are just kind of duped and they have this vision of being an activist, but then they get controlled. Who knows what's going on with all this, but that seems to be something that might be at play here. But since we're sort of running low on time, I just wanted to go in real quick on Prodigy from Mobb Deep. I wonder if you could maybe just give a 5-minute synopsis of his whole story, because I think that's a strange one. And he is one of the people that Tupac called out in that song, Hit 'Em Up.
Well, that's right. It segues nicely out of talking about Tupac, because Prodigy was mentioned in Hit 'Em Up, as you say. Prodigy passed away on the 20th of June, 2017. So the background to him was he was one of the rappers in Mobb Deep who emerged out of Queens, New York, and they broke through in 1994 with their record The Shook Ones Part 2, immediately put him on the map. their rap style was always very hard-hitting, very unforgiving. They always portrayed the gritty, dramatic side of street life. Their records weren't party records. Even though they rang off in the club, they weren't happy records. But that was their style, and that's what Prodigy stuck to. So he was incarcerated for a time. He was imprisoned at some point in the 90s, I believe. And he says he did a whole load of reading while he was inside, and he came across the work of this guy, Dr. Malachi York, who was the figurehead for this New Orleans movement, which seems to be quite similar in many ways to the Universal Zulu Nation, maybe even the Gods and Earths. But he did a whole load of reading and studying, he says, and he came to understand the New World Order plan and secret societies and how they've got a stranglehold on every aspect of humanity. And he says it was very devastating truths for him to come to terms to, and he broke down and wept, and he realized how his people specifically had been kept down systematically through the ages by this wicked control system. And he also realized that many of his peers, such as Jay-Z, who he called out on many occasions as having been a stooge and a foot soldier of this control system, were doing its bidding. And so he started to get very outspoken about this, and he started referencing these findings in his lyrics. He would attack Jay-Z in public comments and interviews, and he said he was going to relentlessly continue to expose him. So he was a very rare voice, somebody that was prepared to be that outspoken. And I personally believe he was quite genuine in that. And the fact that he passed away at the age of 42 might well bear that out. It does have to be acknowledged that he was a lifelong sufferer of a form of sickle cell syndrome. This is even referenced by Tupac on that Hit 'em Up record. And it's well known that he battled with this medical condition for all his life. And so those that are sticking to the official version of what happened say, come on now, don't be too surprised that this guy passed away when he had this condition. But there are some suspicious elements to it. I mean, first of all, he passed away on the 20th of June, which is right at the summer solstice. And when you get into this type of research, you realize that the occultists who control these industries are very much obsessed with solstices, equinoxes, and other important dates along those lines. And you do find that a lot of celebrities just happen to pass away on symbolic, significant dates such as that. Then you've got the fact that the day that he died was World Sickle Cell Awareness Day. So of all the days that he could have passed away, it just happened to be that one. So is there some relevance to that? And you've also got this ridiculous story that surfaced that he apparently choked on an egg. They're saying that he was in his hospital bed and he was eating this hard-boiled egg and he choked on it. And initially it was being implied that that's what killed him. And then the story kind of changed to, it worsened his condition or whatever. But are we looking at some more symbology there with an egg? I mean, you're a guy that gets into all this stuff. Maybe there's something there that we've missed.
Oh, yeah, there's this whole serpent and the egg thing and the golden dawn, and it's being impregnated with the true spirit, and then you crack the egg and you're reborn. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff having to do with the egg in occultism, so that was one of the things that I was like, that's interesting.
Right. And the other thing about that is you get this story that this outspoken, balls to the wall guy that had no problem saying what he felt, and he'd always portrayed this tough, gritty street image, according to the initial reports, dies of eating an egg, which makes him sound a bit kind of soft and wimpy. Not much of a tough guy after all.
Yeah, it's a feminine invoking symbol, for sure.
Yeah, so it's almost a form of mockery and emasculization.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing that's interesting is his story, in prison, learning about this. I've actually talked to a few people who had been in prison, and they always know about the New World Order. It's kind of funny. It's like, I guess when you go in there, that is something that I guess seemingly is talked about a bit, because I used to live in an apartment, and upstairs there was a guy and his roommate, and the guy was a hip hop dude, and he had a fairly successful band or group in Boston. And anyway, so somebody I met through them, he had been in prison, and I had this long conversation with him one time, just kind of randomly, about all of this New World Order shit and whatever. So I'm sure that in the prison system, there's a lot of this kind of literature or these kind of ideas circulating around because it's in such a,
Oh, for sure.
It's like you're in there and life is all fucked up anyway, so you might as well learn about even more fucked up stuff because it's like, when you're out here in the world and you're just, your day-to-day job talking about sports, that stuff's like a big downer, right? But you're already in prison, I'm sure that's kind of like a much more conducive environment to it. But yeah. So anyways, we can move on from that unless you had anything else you wanted to wrap up about him.
Well, I was going to say, how do you feel about holding the Wu-Tang stuff over to the next conversation? Would you be happy to do that? Because I think we can go quite in depth with it, and maybe we should do that. What do you think?
Sure. We can kick it off next time on that, and we'll get into them and Public Enemy, and then come full circle back to Farrakhan, Islam, and Malcolm X, and we'll.
I definitely want to do that, and I'd love to do a part 2 with you, and sooner rather than later as well. I just think we should maybe put on a lid on it for today and then come back and do the rest another time.
For sure. Well, thanks for coming on, Mark, and we'll speak again soon, and everyone can stay tuned for part 2 coming up in the near future.
Okay. Can I just mention my book while I'm on?
Yes. Any links or things coming up, go for it.
Just wanted to mention that my new book is Musical Truth Volume 2, and it's just dropped. It's hot off the presses. The ink is still wet, so I'm quite excited about that. It follows on from many of the themes that I discussed in Volume 1, and a lot of it is tying up some loose ends and revisiting some subject areas, as well as raising new ones. So I'm talking about electronic dance music, the acid house scene, Satanism within heavy metal and heavy rock. I'm talking about infiltration of the punk and new wave scene and how that was used for culture creation and social engineering. Talking about the whole concept of lifetime actors, who they are, what their role is. And I've got a big chapter on, I've got another chapter on Paul McCartney, or is it? Just leave it at that. I've got a chapter on some of the strange symbolism which seemed to foreshadow the reported deaths of Prince and George Michael. I've got a big chapter on 80s pop videos and some of the mind control and occult symbolism that crops up in many of those when you go back and look at them. And I've got a chapter on hip-hop as well. And I'm going into many of the things that we've discussed today, particularly the Afrika Bambaataa Universal Zulu Nation situation. And I'm just talking about the overall degradation of hip-hop and where it's at now and how that whole process happened and how little similarity what we've got today bears to what went before, and going quite in depth about some of that. And again, I think these are all subject areas that you just don't hear other researchers talking about. Maybe they just don't give enough of a shit about hip-hop to want to get into it, or maybe they're just not very well researched in these areas. But I don't hear other people talking about this stuff. That's why this conversation today has been so valuable, and I look forward to part 2. But anyway, Musical Truth 2 is now available on Amazon, so you can just look it up there under Mark Devlin, Musical Truth 2. You can get Volume 1 from there as well. All the background info to the book and some other links to my YouTube videos and my podcasts is available from musicaltruthbook.com and also markdevlin.co.uk. And if anyone would like to get a book from me personally and cut Amazon out of the equation, I'm very happy to mail out a signed copy if you can pay by PayPal. So you just need to drop me an email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com and we can make that happen. And thanks for the podcast today, man. We've had a great conversation, I feel, and we're far from finished. I look forward to completing it.
Yeah, for sure. We'll have you back on real soon and we'll keep going. You could just go forever with this stuff.
Sure can.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mark. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Michael.